Hi, my name's Joe. I'm a software developer and Haskell enthusiast, and this is a demo of some developer tooling that I've been working on recently. The developer tooling I'm talking about is a Haskell Language Server, or HLS plugin, and it's called the HLS Render plugin. Previously, if you wanted to evaluate Haskell code in your IDE, you'd be able to do this via a thing called the HLS eval plugin. And that's designed for evaluating special comments called doctest comments. And a doctest comment looks something like this. It's an expression with a little prefix inside a comment. And if I hit evaluate on that, the eval plugin will calculate the value and it'll insert that value in line. And you can also use the eval plugin to evaluate IO actions. So for instance, here we've got like a write file statement. If I cat example.txt, you'll see that I don't have an example.txt file. If I hit evaluate on that, you'll see that I do, and it has the data in it that you'd expect. So this is really cool, but the way that this works is really designed around populating doctest values. And if what you want to do is just evaluate statements and evaluate your code interactively, it's not tremendously ergonomic. It requires you to write a comment, and it requires you to have any functions that you're going to use imported and in scope. So I've written a Haskell Language Server plugin, the render plugin, which lets you run actions directly. So here we've got this render action called run.io with a different string, and if I hit that, you'll see that that's updated the example file. Now this is type driven. It works based on this file, which is full of functions called by default renderActions.hs, and this contains a bunch of values. And the way the plugin works is it'll iterate through these values, and if there's a top level declaration and it can apply one of these values as a function to that top level declaration, then it'll create a render action which will show up as a code lens which will do that. So run.io, the render action that I just demonstrated, is just the identity function but specialized to IO. So that's saying, like, if you've got an IO action, return that action, and that's the action that happens when you click on the code lens. But you can also define more interesting things. So I've also got a render action for string here, which writes the string to a temp file and then opens that temp file in the IDE in VS Code. So if I go back to my example file, if I click on the render action for this string, that'll get opened in a sort of separate tab in my IDE. And this works with slightly richer stuff as well, like you can write a render action that operates on IO actions that return strings, which is a composition of the render action for just opening strings. And if I click on this, it'll read the contents of the example.txt file, write that into a text file, and then open it. So you can see the contents of that file here. Now, this is pretty cool, but I think this plugin really shines when you get into types that are, for want of a better word, a bit richer. Like supposing you're writing Haskell code that generates pictures, maybe with the Juicy Pixels library. Well, you might have some code that returns a Juicy Pixels image, and you can write a render action that handles that and does the same thing, writes it out to a file, opens that in your IDE. And if I click on this render action, that'll take a second, but you can see that that image is Haskell code for a Mandelbrot set. So if you click on that, you get in a new tab an open image of the Mandelbrot set. And this is interactive, or at least semi-interactive. So I can make changes to the code here. I can rerun that render action. And now I've got a Mandelbrot set in a different color. My motivation for writing this plugin is that I maintain a Haskell solid modeling library called Waterfall. I use that for defining solid objects, primarily for 3D printing. And I wanted to be able to define solid objects in Haskell and be able to click on something in my IDE and then see those solid objects without having to specifically like write code that saved those to a file. So I've got a render action that takes a waterfall solid. I've got a definition of some waterfall solid here, and I can click on that, and that gets rendered to an STL file. Waterfall CAD supports a number of file formats. One of them's STL. I have an STL viewer installed in VS Code. So I've now got this 3D object that I can interact with. And again, I can sort of make changes to that. I can rerun the render action, and here you can see that I've updated that object to have sort of smaller holes in it. Waterfall CAD doesn't just support outputting 3D models, it also supports diagrams, it supports images in SVG, I've got a separate render action that'll open a 3D model as an SVG, and this demonstrates the plugin working on multiple values at once. Now, at this stage, I'd like to sort of do a call to action. I'm really pleased with this as a proof of concept, but at the moment it's just a proof of concept. So I'm kind of looking for two things. If you're a Haskell dev and you'd find this useful, please let me know. If you've got any feedback, I'd love to hear that. If you're a Haskell Language Server developer, though, by the time this video goes out, I should have a draft PR open, and I'd really like it if I could get some help with that. At the moment, I think this Haskell Language Server plugin is demoable, but I don't think it's necessarily mergeable. Haskell Language Server has a plugin structure, but those are statically linked, so in order for people to use something, it has to be merged into the main body of Haskell Language Server code. And there are a number of things with this project that I don't think are mergeable at the moment. The really big one is I don't think that the way that I'm evaluating the render actions HS file is acceptable. I don't think I'm doing that in a way that would make sense to merge into the main body of code. I'm doing the equivalent of copying and pasting the contents of that file into a GHCI session, and that means that the variables in that file exist in the same namespace as the variables in the module that you're running the action in the context of. And I can sort of demonstrate that by commenting out this value in the render actions file. Now this has a name collision with one of the values in the module. If I navigate back to this lib value, I no longer have a render action available for some waterfall solid, because as far as the render actions plugin is concerned, the some waterfall solid value in the render actions module hides that. So I'd really like some help with that, but on top of that there's some general code quality stuff, and there should be more detail on the PR. So thanks for your help and thanks for your time. Please get in touch.